I've spent 30 years trying to forget what happened in that house. 30 years of sleepless nights, of jumping at shadows, of hearing those screams echo through my dreams. But some stories demand to be told, even if the telling brings back everything you've tried to bury. My name is Edmund Blackwood, and in the autumn of 1842, I was a physician newly graduated from Edinburgh Medical College. Young, ambitious, and foolishly confident in the power of modern science to explain away the darkness that lurks at the edges of our understanding. How naive I was then, believing that madness could be categorized, treated, contained within the neat boundaries of medical texts. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a weathered coachman who refused to step foot inside my practice. He thrust the envelope at me with trembling hands and departed before I could offer him refreshment. The wax seal bore an unfamiliar crest, two serpents intertwined around a willow tree. Inside, written in an elegant but unsteady hand, was an invitation that would forever change the course of my life. Dr. Blackwood, it began, your recent treatise on juvenile hysteria has reached my attention. I find myself in desperate need of your expertise regarding a most peculiar case involving my daughters. The compensation for your services would be most generous. £500 for a fortnight's observation and treatment. Please come at once to Fenley Manor, 3 days' ride north of Edinburgh, beyond the village of Dunmore. Tell no one of your destination. The coachman who delivered this letter will return for your answer within the hour. I pray you will not refuse a father's plea. Lord Aldrich Fenley. £500. It was more than I'd earn in 2 years of regular practice. But it wasn't the money that ultimately swayed my decision. It was professional curiosity. Juvenile hysteria in sisters? The research possibilities were tantalizing. I penned my acceptance and packed my medical bag with the confidence of a man who believed science held all the answers. The journey to Fenley Manor was itself an ordeal that should have warned me away. Past Edinburgh, the roads grew progressively worse, civilization thinning until we passed through villages where the inhabitants watched our carriage with suspicious, hollow eyes. The coachman spoke only once during the entire 3-day journey, and that was to mutter a prayer when we passed through Dunmore, a gray, lifeless place where not even children played in the streets. Beyond Dunmore, the landscape transformed into something primordial. Ancient forests pressed against the narrow road, their canopy so thick that we traveled in perpetual twilight despite the noon sun. The trees here grew wrong, twisted into impossible angles, their bark bearing strange markings that looked almost like faces frozen in silent screams. Even the birds fell quiet in those woods, and the only sound was the steady clop of hooves and the creaking of the carriage wheels. It was nearly dusk on the 3rd day when Fenley Manor finally came into view, and my first glimpse of it made my blood run cold. The house squatted against a gray sky like some massive stone beast, its Gothic towers and gabled roofs creating a jagged silhouette that seemed to pierce the darkening clouds. The manor was enormous, far larger than any country estate had a right to be, with entire wings that appeared abandoned, their windows dark and broken like dead eyes. The grounds were equally unsettling. What should have been manicured gardens had grown wild, creating a labyrinth of overgrown hedges and gnarled trees. Stone statues, weathered beyond recognition, stood sentinel along the winding drive, their features eroded into suggestions of faces that seemed to shift and change in the dying light. The air itself felt heavy here, thick with an oppressive silence that made breathing difficult. Lord Fenley met me at the entrance, a gaunt man in his 50s with the pallor of someone who rarely saw sunlight. His eyes, a pale blue that bordered on colorless, held a desperate quality that immediately put me on edge. His handshake was cold and clammy, and when he spoke, his voice carried an undertone of barely suppressed panic. Dr. Blackwood, thank God you've come. The situation has deteriorated since I wrote to you. Please, we must discuss the terms of your engagement before you meet them. He glanced nervously toward the upper floors. There are things you must understand, precautions you must take. He led me to his study, a dark-paneled room that reeked of old leather and something else, something sweet and cloying that made my stomach turn. The walls were lined with medical texts, but also stranger volumes. books bound in unusual materials with titles in languages I couldn't identify. Lord Fenley poured himself a generous measure of brandy, his hands shaking so violently that the crystal decanter rattled against the glass. "My daughters," he began, then paused, struggling to find the words. "Eliza and Eleanor. They're 17 now, born just minutes apart on a night when the stars aligned in ways the astronomers called impossible. Their mother," his voice broke. "Their mother died bringing them into this world, but not before she spoke a warning that I foolishly dismissed as delirium." The brandy seemed to steady him slightly. "Doctor, my daughters have never spoken a single word to another living soul. Not to me, not to their governesses, not to anyone. They speak only to each other, in a language no linguist has been able to identify. And when anyone else tries to communicate with them directly," he shuddered, "they scream, doctor. They scream in ways that no human throat should be capable of producing." Lord Fenley's warning hadn't prepared me for the reality. Nothing could have. He led me through corridors that seemed to stretch longer than the exterior of the house should allow, past portraits whose eyes followed our movement with unnatural precision. The manor's interior was a study in decay barely held at bay. Expensive furnishings covered in dust, elaborate tapestries moth-eaten and fading, chandelier crystals clouded with age. Servants, when we encountered them, moved with their heads down, never making eye contact, their footsteps eerily silent on the worn carpets. "The twins occupy the entire east wing," Lord Fenley explained as we climbed a spiral staircase that groaned beneath our weight. "We found it best to give them space. The servants who tend to them have learned to announce themselves from a great distance and never approach directly. Even then, we lose staff regularly. Most refuse to return after a single encounter." The temperature dropped noticeably as we entered the east wing. My breath misted in the air, and frost patterns decorated the windows despite the autumn warmth outside. The wallpaper here was different, a repeating pattern of what looked like birds in flight, but the longer I stared, the more they resembled something else. Faces, perhaps, or hands reaching out from the walls themselves. "They know you're coming," Lord Fenley whispered. "They always know." We stopped before an ornate door marked with strange symbols chalked along its frame. From beyond came a sound that made my skin crawl. Two voices speaking in perfect synchronization, their words alien yet oddly hypnotic. It wasn't quite singing, wasn't quite chanting, but something in between that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my bones. "I'll leave you to observe," Lord Fenley said, backing away. "They respond poorly to my presence. The viewing port there," he indicated a small sliding panel in the door, "will allow you to watch safely. Whatever you do, doctor, do not enter without announcing yourself first. And if they begin to scream," he trailed off, his face pale, "cover your ears and leave immediately." Alone in that frigid corridor, I approached the viewing port with the caution of a man approaching a wild animal. What I saw through that small window would haunt me forever. The room beyond was vast, far larger than should have been possible given the manor's architecture. The twins sat in the center, facing each other on the floor, their legs crossed, their hands clasped. They were beautiful in an unsettling way, identical down to the smallest detail, with long black hair that seemed to move of its own accord, as if suspended in water. Their skin was pale as moonlight, almost translucent, with blue veins visible beneath like delicate lacework. But it was their eyes that truly disturbed me. They were completely black. No whites, no iris, just endless pools of darkness that seemed to pull at something deep in my chest when I looked at them. They wore simple white gowns that appeared to glow in the dim light filtering through the curtained windows. As I watched, they continued their strange dialogue, their lips moving in perfect unison, creating a stereo effect that made it impossible to tell which twin was speaking. The language they used was unlike anything I'd encountered in my studies, guttural yet melodic, with sounds that human vocal cords shouldn't have been able to produce. Sometimes I caught what seemed like words borrowed from Latin or Greek, but twisted into new forms that hurt to hear. Their room was sparsely furnished. 2 beds pushed against opposite walls, a single mirror that had been turned to face the corner, and hundreds upon hundreds of papers scattered across the floor. Each paper was covered in symbols and diagrams that made my eyes water to look at directly. Some appeared to be star charts, but the constellations were wrong, showing arrangements of stars that didn't exist in our sky. I must have made some sound. A gasp perhaps, or a shift of my weight that caused the floorboard to creak, because suddenly both twins' heads snapped toward the door in perfect synchronization. Those black eyes fixed on the viewing port, on me, and I felt their gaze like ice water in my veins. They smiled then, both of them, revealing teeth that were perfectly white but somehow wrong in their arrangement. Too many, or perhaps too few, I couldn't tell. The smile wasn't welcoming. It was the expression of predators who had just spotted prey. One twin, I couldn't tell which, raised a hand and beckoned me to enter. The gesture was slow, deliberate, and something about it made every instinct scream at me to run. But I was a man of science, I reminded myself. These were troubled young women who needed medical attention, nothing more. I announced myself loudly as Lord Fenley had instructed, speaking through the door. I am Dr. Edmund Blackwood. I'm here to help you. May I enter? The response was immediate and horrifying. Both twins opened their mouths and screamed. Not the sharp, short scream of surprise or fear, but a sustained, harmonized shriek that seemed to go on impossibly long without them drawing breath. The sound was wrong on every level. It contained frequencies that shouldn't exist, notes that human ears weren't meant to process. The viewing port glass cracked, spiderwebbing from the sonic assault. I felt warm liquid on my upper lip and realized my nose was bleeding. But worse than the physical effects was what the scream did to my mind. In that horrible sound, I heard things, whispers in languages long dead, the crying of children who had never been born, the sound of stars dying in the void. I saw flashes of images, twisted landscapes under foreign suns, cities of impossible geometry, and things that crawled and writhed in spaces between spaces. I stumbled away from the door, my hands clamped over my ears, blood streaming from my nose. The screaming followed me down the corridor, seeming to come from the walls themselves, from the air, from inside my own skull. I ran, dignity abandoned, until I collapsed in the main hall, gasping for breath. Lord Fenley found me there, curled on the cold stone floor, my medical bag spilled open beside me. He helped me to a sitting room and pressed a glass of brandy into my shaking hands. The first time is always the worst, he said quietly. The servants who stay learn to acclimate, though none remain wholly unchanged. Took 3 glasses of brandy before I could speak coherently. What are they? I managed to ask, abandoning all pretense of scientific detachment. They are my daughters, Lord Fenley replied, but his eyes suggested he wasn't entirely certain of that truth. Whatever else they might be, they came from my wife's womb. They carry my blood. That must count for something in God's eyes. Over the following days, I developed a different approach. Rather than attempting direct interaction, I observed the twins from a distance, studying their patterns, documenting their behavior. What I discovered challenged everything I understood about human psychology and physiology. The twins never slept, or rather, they never slept at the same time. One would lie perfectly still while the other moved about the room, engaging in activities that defied explanation. I watched Eleanor. I learned to distinguish them by a small birthmark on Eleanor's left hand. Spend 6 hours drawing the same symbol over and over, thousands of times, each iteration slightly different from the last. When she finished, Eliza would wake, study the drawings, and then burn them all in the fireplace, watching the smoke with an intensity that suggested she was reading something in its patterns. They never ate food in any conventional sense. Meals were brought to their room 3 times daily, but the servants would find the plates unchanged except for strange marks, as if something had tasted the essence of the food without consuming its physical form. Yet the twins showed no signs of malnutrition. If anything, they seemed to glow with an unnatural vitality. Their synchronization went beyond mere twin behavior. When one was injured, Eleanor cut her hand on a shard of glass. Eliza's hand bled in the exact same spot despite being untouched. They breathed in alternating rhythms, one inhaling as the other exhaled, creating a constant whisper of air that sounded almost like words. But it was their writing that disturbed me most. Those countless papers covered in symbols weren't random. There was a pattern, a progression. I began photographing them with a camera obscura I'd brought for documenting medical cases. When I developed the images and arranged them in sequence, something extraordinary and terrifying emerged. The symbols were mathematical in nature, but the mathematics were impossible. They described geometries that couldn't exist in three-dimensional space, equations that violated fundamental laws of physics. One series appeared to be calculating the precise conditions necessary for something. The final symbol in each sequence was always the same, a spiral that seemed to move when you looked at it directly, pulling your gaze into its center. I showed my findings to Lord Fenley, hoping for some explanation. His reaction was not what I expected. He broke down weeping, clutching at my coat. "It's getting worse," he sobbed. "Every year they grow stronger, more synchronized. The screaming used to be just sound. Now it carries things. The servants have been having nightmares, all the same nightmare. They see the twins standing over their beds, speaking in that horrible language, and when they wake, they find marks on their bodies. Symbols like the ones in those drawings." He showed me his own arms then, pulling up his sleeves to reveal skin covered in thin, raised scars forming the same spiral pattern I'd seen in the twins' drawings. "They appear while I sleep," he whispered. "I've tried everything, locked doors, blessed salt, even sleeping in the church. Nothing stops them." That night, I experienced it myself. I woke from a dreamless sleep to find both twins standing at the foot of my bed. They hadn't opened the door. It remained locked from the inside. They simply stood there, holding hands, their black eyes reflecting no light from the moon outside my window. They spoke in unison, their voices layered and hollow. "You want to understand us, Doctor. But understanding requires participation. Knowledge demands sacrifice. The pattern must be completed." I tried to speak, to move, but my body wouldn't respond. I could only watch as they approached, their movements fluid and synchronized like dancers following unheard music. Eleanor reached out and touched my forehead with one finger, and in that touch I saw everything. I saw the night they were born, under a sky where stars formed configurations that shouldn't exist. I saw their mother, not dying in childbirth but speaking words in the same alien language the twins used, words that seemed to tear her apart from the inside. I saw Lord Fenley, younger then, making a bargain with something that wore the shape of a man but whose shadow moved independently, promising anything for healthy children after years of miscarriages. And I saw what the twins were building with their symbols and their screams. They were creating a door, or perhaps widening one that already existed. Each symbol was a key, each scream a call to something that waited on the other side of reality's thin membrane. When the twins finally left my room, simply fading away like morning mist rather than using the door, I found I could move again. My forehead burned where Eleanor had touched me, and in the mirror, I could see a small spiral mark forming on the skin. It would be the first of many. Unable to return to sleep, I ventured into the servants' quarters, hoping to find someone, anyone, who could shed light on what I'd experienced. The kitchen was still warm from the evening's cooking, and there I found Mrs. Crawford, the head housekeeper, sitting alone with a cup of tea that had long gone cold. She looked up as I entered, unsurprised by my presence. "You've seen them, then?" she said. It wasn't a question. The night visits always start around the second week. "You lasted longer than most. How long have you been here?" I asked, settling across from her. 23 years, since before the twins were born. I was here for that night." She shuddered, pulling her shawl tighter. "I helped deliver them. God forgive me. I helped bring them into this world." She told me things Lord Fenley had omitted from his account. The pregnancy had been strange from the beginning. Lady Fenley had spoken of dreams where she walked through cities of glass and bone, where twin suns cast shadows that moved against the light. She developed an aversion to religious symbols, screaming when she saw crosses or heard church bells. In her final months, she'd taken to drawing the same symbols the twins now created, covering the walls of her bedchamber with them until Lord Fenley had them painted over. The night of the birth, Mrs. Crawford continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, the whole house changed. The corridors stretched and twisted. Rooms appeared that hadn't existed before. We found ourselves in parts of the manor that couldn't possibly fit within its walls. And the sounds, not just Lady Fenley's screams, but something answering her from somewhere else. She showed me a journal she'd kept, documenting the strange occurrences that had plagued the manor since that night. Servants aging years and days, then returning to normal. Mirrors showing reflections of rooms that didn't exist. The discovery of a sub-basement that predated the manor itself, filled with stone tablets covered in the same symbols the twins drew. There was a priest, she said. Father Morrison from Dunmore. Lord Fenley brought him here when the twins were 3, hoping he could help them. He spent one night in their room. She paused, her hands trembling around her teacup. We found him the next morning in the garden. He'd clawed his own eyes out and bitten off his tongue. Before he died, he managed to write one word in the dirt, opening. Other servants had similar stories. Thomas, the groundskeeper, spoke of finding circles of dead grass where the twins had walked, grass that when examined closely, had been transformed into a crystalline substance that cut like glass. Mary, a young maid, told me through tears how she'd seen the twins standing in the garden at midnight, apparently teaching words in their strange language to something she couldn't quite see. A shadow that stood between them, taller than any man, with too many angles to its form. But it was James, Lord Fenley's valet, who provided the most disturbing account. He'd been in Lord Fenley's employ the longest, since before his marriage. He told me about the man who'd visited the estate shortly before Lord Fenley met his wife, a traveling scholar who claimed to study ancient civilizations. He had books, James said, glancing nervously at the door as if afraid of being overheard. Books that Lord Fenley still keeps locked in his study. Books that showed how to invite things, how to make bargains with entities that exist in the spaces between spaces. Lord Fenley was desperate for an heir, you see. His line would end with him otherwise. What was the bargain? I asked, though I feared I already knew. Children, James replied. Healthy children who would carry on the bloodline. But the things that answered, they have their own purposes. The children would be bridges, the scholar said, living doorways between our world and theirs. That night, I confronted Lord Fenley with what I'd learned. I found him in his study, surrounded by those ancient books James had mentioned. They were horrible things, bound in what looked like human skin, written in languages that predated known civilization. One lay open on his desk, showing a diagram that perfectly matched the pattern the twins had been creating with their symbols. I had no choice, he said without looking up. You don't understand what it's like, watching your family line wither away. 3 wives, all barren or producing stillborn children. The family curse, they called it. But he showed me a way, a trade. My bloodline would continue, stronger than ever, and in return, he laughed bitterly. In return, my children would serve as anchors for something that has been trying to enter our world since before human memory. We have to stop them, I said. Whatever they're building, whatever they're summoning, stop them. Lord Fenley looked at me with hollow eyes. Doctor, we can't even speak to them without bleeding from our ears. They're growing stronger every day. Soon, they won't need the symbols anymore. The screams alone will be enough to tear open the veil. As if in response to his words, a harmonized humming began from the east wing, a sound that made the very air vibrate with malevolent energy. The books on the shelves began to shake, and I watched in horror as the text on their pages rearranged itself, forming the now familiar spiral pattern. The twins were accelerating their work, and I was beginning to understand that I hadn't been brought here to cure them. I'd been brought to witness, to document, to be another key in the lock they were methodically picking. The change came on my 10th night at Fenley Manor. I woke not to the twins at my bedside, but to the sound of every door in the house opening and closing in sequence, a rhythmic banging that seemed to spell out a message in some form of percussive Morse code. When it finally stopped, I found my bedroom door standing wide open, and in the hallway beyond, a trail of those crystallized grass fragments leading toward the east wing. Against every instinct of self-preservation, I followed. The manor was different in the deep night. The corridors didn't quite match my memory of them. Paintings I'd passed dozens of times now showed different subjects. The pastoral landscapes replaced by twisted vistas under alien stars. The grandfather clock in the main hall ran backward, its hands spinning counterclockwise at increasing speed. And everywhere, that oppressive feeling of something vast and hungry pressing against the boundaries of our world. I found the twins in a room I'd never seen before, a circular chamber that couldn't possibly exist within the manor's architecture. The walls were covered floor to ceiling with their symbols, drawn in what looked like phosphorescent ink that pulsed with its own light. The twins stood in the center, no longer facing each other but standing back to back, their arms outstretched, their fingers weaving through the air in intricate patterns. They were speaking, but not in unison this time. Instead, they alternated words, creating a conversation or perhaps an incantation that seemed to build upon itself with each exchange. The language had changed too. It was older now, more primal, sounds that predated human speech. I should have run. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to flee. But the spiral mark on my forehead burned with cold fire, and I found myself drawn into the room, my feet moving without my conscious control. The twins' eyes opened, when had they closed them, and fixed on me. Eleanor smiled, that too wide smile that showed those wrong teeth, and spoke in perfectly clear English for the first time. "Dr. Blackwood," she said, her voice layered with harmonics that shouldn't exist. "You've been very patient. Would you like to know what we really are?" Before I could respond, Eliza continued, "We are not entirely your Lord Fenley's daughters. We are partially human, yes, but we are also something else. Vessels. Conduits. The biological equivalent of the symbols we draw." They moved toward me in that synchronized way, circling me like predators. As they walked, I noticed their footsteps left those same crystallized marks on the floor, and the air around them shimmered like heat waves despite the cold. "Our mother understood at the end," Eleanor said. "When she felt us growing inside her, she knew what she was bringing into the world. That's why she tried to warn Father. But it was too late. The bargain was struck. We were already taking shape, cell by cell, molecule by molecule, designed to be living keys to locks that should never be opened. But we are not without consciousness," Eliza added. "We feel. We think. We know what we are and what we were meant to do. And we've spent 17 years fighting against our purpose." This revelation stunned me. Fighting? But the symbols, the preparations, are not to open the door, they said in unison. They're to seal it permanently. They showed me then, touching my temples with their fingertips, and through that contact, I saw the truth. The entity that had answered Lord Fenley's desperate plea wasn't merely from another dimension. It was a parasite of cosmic proportions, a thing that moved from reality to reality, consuming them from within. It needed biological anchors to maintain its grip on a world, and the twins were meant to be those anchors. But something had gone wrong, or perhaps, from our perspective, right? The human part of the twins, the part that was truly Lord Fenley and Lady Fenley's children, had proven stronger than anticipated. They'd learned to use their otherworldly abilities not to serve their intended purpose, but to subvert it. Every symbol they drew, every scream they produced, was actually part of an immensely complex ward, a barrier being built from the inside out. "The screaming," I gasped, understanding flooding through me. "It's not to communicate with the entity. It's to hurt it," Eleanor confirmed. "Our voices, properly modulated, cause it pain. Drive it back. That's why we scream when humans approach. Your presence weakens our control, makes us more vulnerable to its influence." "But we're running out of time," Eliza said, and for the first time, I heard fear in her voice. "It's been 17 years. The stars are almost in alignment again, the same configuration as the night we were born. If we can't complete the seal before then..." She didn't need to finish. I understood. The entity would use them as intended, tearing open a permanent rift between worlds. Our reality would be consumed, digested, absorbed into the hungry void of the thing's existence. "What do you need from me?" I asked. They exchanged a look, the first time I'd seen them communicate in a recognizably human way. "We need you to do what we cannot," they said together. "We need you to destroy us." The twins' request hung in the air like a physical presence. Destroy them. Kill two young women who had spent their entire existence fighting against the monstrous purpose for which they'd been created. "There must be another way," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I knew they were hollow. Eleanor shook her head sadly. "We are the anchors. As long as we exist, so does the connection. We've managed to twist our purpose, to use our nature against itself, but we can't sever the link entirely. Only death can do that. But it must be done correctly," Eliza added. "At the precise moment when the stars align, when the connection is at its strongest. Too early, and the entity will have time to find new anchors. Too late, and the door will already be open." They led me to another hidden room, this one deep beneath the manor in the subbasement Mrs. Crawford had mentioned. The stone here was ancient, predating the house by millennia. The walls were covered in symbols far older than the ones the twins drew, the original language from which theirs was derived. In the center of the room was a stone altar, its surface carved with channels that led to 7 collection points around its perimeter. The twins had clearly been preparing for this moment for years, perhaps their entire lives. "This is where we were truly born," Eleanor explained. "Not in Mother's bedchamber, but here where the bargain was sealed. And this is where we must die." They showed me a collection of items they'd gathered, silver daggers that had been blessed and cursed in equal measure, herbs that existed in no botanical text, candles made from the fat of things that weren't quite animals. Everything needed for a ritual that would not just kill them, but completely sever their connection to the entity. "Father must not know," Eliza said urgently. "He still believes we can be saved, that there's a cure for what we are. His love makes him blind to the necessity of our death." Over the next 3 nights, we prepared in secret. The twins taught me the words I would need to speak, painful words that felt like broken glass in my throat. They showed me the exact movements required, the precise angle of the blades, the timing that had to be perfect down to the second. During the days, I maintained the pretense of studying them, of working on a treatment. Lord Fenley, desperate for any hope, believed my lies about progress being made. The servants, sensing something changing in the house's atmosphere, kept their distance more than ever. On the final night, as the stars began their fatal alignment, I made my way to the subbasement. The twins were already there, kneeling beside the altar, their hands clasped in what might have been prayer. They dressed in simple white robes, their long black hair unbound and spreading across the floor like spilled ink. "Are you certain?" I asked one last time. They looked up at me with those impossible black eyes, and for just a moment, I saw them as they might have been. 2 normal girls, laughing, playing, living lives untouched by cosmic horror. The vision passed, leaving only the reality of what they were and what needed to be done. "We've been certain since the day we understood our purpose," they said together. "We choose to die as humans rather than live as doorways." I began the ritual as they taught me, speaking words in that ancient tongue that predated human civilization. The candles flared to life without being lit, casting dancing shadows that moved independently of the flames. The symbols on the walls began to glow, pulsing in rhythm with my words. The twins lay upon the altar, side by side, their hands still clasped. They began to speak in their synchronized way, but this time I understood the words. They were saying goodbye, to each other, to the world they'd never truly been part of, to the human lives they'd never been allowed to live. As I raised the silver daggers, the very air began to tear. I could see through the rips in reality to the thing that waited on the other side. A mass of writhing darkness shot through with veins of sickly light, enormous beyond comprehension, hungry beyond measure. Pressed against the tears, trying to force its way through. The twins screamed then, one last time, but this scream was different. It was human. It was pain and fear and defiance all mixed into a sound that broke my heart even as it saved our world. The entity recoiled from that purely human sound, pulling back just as I brought the daggers down. What happened next defied all rational description. Light and darkness exploded from the twins' bodies simultaneously, spiraling around each other in a double helix of energy that shot upward through the ceiling, through the manor, into the night sky. The symbols on the walls blazed so bright I had to close my eyes, and when I opened them, the tears in reality were sealing themselves, the entity's writhing mass receding, growing smaller, disappearing into whatever void it had come from. The twins died as the church bells of Dunmore struck midnight, their passing marked by a sudden stillness that seemed to encompass the entire world. For a moment, just a heartbeat, everything stopped. The wind, the rain that had begun to fall, even the flames of the candles froze in place. Then, with a sound like the universe exhaling, everything resumed. But the twins' bodies were gone. Where they had lain on the altar, there were only 2 small piles of the crystallized grass I'd seen throughout my stay, arranged in perfect spirals. As I watched, even these began to dissolve, turning to a fine powder that seemed to evaporate into nothingness. I don't remember making my way back to the manor proper. I was found the next morning by Lord Fenley, collapsed in the entrance hall, the silver daggers still clutched in my hands. He took one look at my face, at the expression I wore, and knew. The howl of grief that tore from his throat was barely human, a father's anguish mixed with the terrible understanding of necessity. "They're gone," I told him when he'd finally quieted. "But they died as themselves, not as tools for something else's purpose. They died as your daughters." The change in Fenley Manor was immediate and profound. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the place lifted like morning fog. The servants reported that their nightmares had ceased, that the strange marks on their skin had faded. The impossible rooms disappeared, the corridors returned to their normal configuration, and the symbols the twins had drawn over 17 years simply vanished, as if they'd never existed at all. Lord Fenley aged 20 years in as many days. He dismissed most of the servants, closed the east wing permanently, and retreated into solitude. Before I left, he gave me a package, all the books and materials related to the bargain he'd made, with instructions to destroy them. "Let it end with them," he said. "Let their sacrifice mean something." I returned to Edinburgh, but I couldn't resume my practice. How could I go back to treating common ailments when I'd witnessed the salvation of our reality? The marks the twins had left on me, not just the spiral on my forehead, which had faded to a faint scar, but the psychological scars, made it impossible to pretend the ordinary world was all that existed. I burned Lord Fenley's books as he'd asked, but not before documenting some of what they contained. Not the rituals or summoning, God forbid anyone should ever attempt such things again, but the warnings, the signs to watch for, the knowledge that might help someone recognize if such entities tried to enter our world through other means. For 6 months, I wandered, unable to settle anywhere. I'd wake in the night, certain I heard the twins' synchronized voices, only to find silence. Sometimes, in my peripheral vision, I'd catch glimpses of them, 2 pale figures standing hand in hand, watching me with those black eyes. But when I turned, there was never anything there. It was during this wandering that I received word of Lord Fenley's death. He'd been found in the sealed East Wing, in the very room where the twins had spent their lives. There was no sign of forced entry. The doors remained locked from the outside. He'd simply appeared there, lying peaceful on the floor, his hands clasped over his chest in the same way the twins had held hands. The servants who found him swore they heard, just for a moment, the sound of 2 young women laughing. Not the terrible synchronized sound they'd known, but the normal, joyful laughter of teenagers who had finally found peace. The manor was abandoned after that. The remaining servants fled, and within a year, the forest had begun to reclaim it. I returned once, 5 years later, driven by a compulsion I couldn't explain. The house was a ruin, the roof collapsed, vines choking the walls. But the sub-basement remained intact, and on the altar, I found something that shouldn't have existed, 2 flowers, pure white, growing from solid stone. They were unlike any species known to botany, their petals arranged in perfect spirals. I picked them carefully and pressed them in my journal. They're still there, 30 years later, as fresh as the day I found them. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I swear I can hear them whispering in that strange language the twins used. But the words no longer frighten me. They sound like gratitude, like goodbye. The official records list the Fenley twins as having died of a wasting illness, their bodies buried in the family crypt. There's no mention of their true nature, their 17-year battle against cosmic horror, or their ultimate sacrifice. History forgot them as perhaps they wished to be forgotten. But I remember Eliza and Eleanor Fenley, the twins who spoke only to each other and answered strangers with screams. Not because they were monsters, but because they were heroes, holding back the darkness with every synchronized word, every harmonized shriek. They were 17 years old when they chose to die rather than become the keys to humanity's destruction. I'm an old man now, my medical career long behind me. I've spent these 30 years researching, investigating claims of similar occurrences around the world. Twice, I've encountered situations that bore the hallmarks of the same entity trying to establish new anchors. Both times, I was able to prevent it using knowledge the twins had died to protect. But I'm dying now. The cancer that riddles my body is beyond any medicine of our age. Soon, I'll take the twin story with me to the grave, and perhaps that's for the best. Some knowledge is too dangerous to preserve, some truths too terrible to remember. Yet, as I write these final words, I find I cannot let their sacrifice be completely forgotten. So I leave this account, hidden among my papers, for some future soul to find. Not as a warning, the twins ensured we need no warning against that particular threat, but as a testament. Evil exists, vast and hungry and utterly alien to our understanding. But so does good, sometimes in the most unexpected forms. Two young women, born to be doorways for cosmic horror, chose instead to be the locks that kept it out. They spoke only to each other because every word between them was part of a 17-year spell of protection. They screamed at strangers because human contact weakened their control over the monstrous purpose encoded in their very cells. They were never mad. They were never evil. They were two sisters who loved each other and the world enough to die for it. I feel them near me now as I write these last sentences. Not as the terrifying figures who once stood at my bedside, but as they might have been, two young women smiling, free at last from the burden they carried from birth. They don't speak, but I understand what they've come to tell me. The door is sealed, the sacrifice held. The world spins on, oblivious to how close it came to ending, protected by the love of two sisters who spoke only to each other, and whose screams saved us all. This is the truth of the Fenley sisters. This is how the world was saved by screams. And now, as the sun sets on my final day, I hear them calling, not in that terrible synchronized voice, but in the gentle tones of young women welcoming an old friend home. The spiral on my forehead burns cold one last time, and I understand. The story ends where it began, with an invitation I cannot refuse.